My daughter-in-law demanded my apartment keys at my son's wedding. The wedding hall glittered with chandeliers, soft golden light cascading over elegant tables and meticulously arranged floral decorations. The air was thick with the hum of polite conversation, laughter, and the distant clinking of champagne glasses. I had never imagined that this day, meant to celebrate love and union, would turn into one of the most humiliating and shocking moments of my life. I stood beside my son, feeling a strange mix of pride and unease. My daughter-in-law, dressed in an extravagant gown, approached me with a purposeful expression. Her voice was firm and demanding as she asked for the keys to my apartment, right there in front of hundreds of guests. I froze for a second, then calmly shook my head. My response was simple, a polite, firm refusal. My calm demeanor, I hoped, would diffuse the situation, but instead, it seemed to ignite her fury. The hall seemed to pause for a moment, the music fading into a distant murmur as all eyes turned toward us. She slapped me hard across the face, a shocking act of disrespect that left the room gasping. I didn't react. My face remained composed, my expression unbroken, my eyes calm. My son's jaw tightened, the color draining from his face as he looked between us, unsure of what to say. The guests whispered, shock and tension rippling through the crowd. I stood there, silently, letting the weight of the moment settle. This wasn't just about a slap. It was about entitlement, arrogance, and a lack of respect for the man who had built a life, a home, and a foundation for this very family. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't retaliate. I simply smiled, not in submission, but in quiet, unshakable confidence. The calmness in my demeanor seemed to confuse her further, throwing her off balance as she realized that her public display of aggression had not intimidated me. As the music slowly resumed and the whispers of the guests lingered in the air, I felt the shift begin. I noticed the subtle glances exchanged between the event staff, the photographers, and even some relatives who had previously been allies of my daughter-in-law. The social tide was beginning to turn, almost imperceptibly, yet decisively. My smile remained, quiet and knowing, as if to say, "You have no idea what you've just set in motion." Every movement, every gesture that followed carried weight. The bride, in her gown, tried to maintain composure, but her body language betrayed her. She hesitated near me, unsure how to reconcile the public confrontation with the familial expectations of the day. My son, usually so composed, looked shocked, the tension in his shoulders visible even from where I stood. I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that my restraint had already begun to unravel the arrogance that had led to this public display. The rest of the evening unfolded with subtle shifts in attention. People lingered around, whispering, stealing glances at the man who had been publicly slapped and yet remained unshaken. I walked through the hall, greeting a few distant relatives, offering polite smiles and nods. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, fidgeted, her confidence fading as she realized that her actions, meant to assert dominance, had not achieved the intended effect. By the end of the night, a quiet storm of anticipation had begun to build in my mind. The slap had been public, but the real reckoning, I knew, would be far more private, calculated, and precise. I had the knowledge, the patience, and the control to ensure that the lesson would not just be delivered, it would be unforgettable. And as I glanced around the hall one last time before leaving, I knew that the day's events were only the opening act of a story that would soon unfold with full impact. After the slap, I retreated quietly to my seat at the edge of the hall, keeping my composure while the echoes of the incident lingered in the air like a storm cloud. Every eye in the room had been drawn to the confrontation, and the whispers that rippled through the guests carried a mix of shock, judgment, and curiosity. I let the murmurs wash over me without flinching. Public humiliation, I had learned long ago, was far less powerful than quiet, strategic action. I studied my daughter-in-law carefully. The confidence she had displayed just moments ago was cracking, imperceptibly at first, then more obvious with each passing second. Her carefully rehearsed posture was faltering. Her eyes darted nervously between relatives, the staff, and my son, as though seeking support that wasn't there. Her scheme, her sense of entitlement, had relied on intimidation, and the fact that I had not responded as expected was unraveling her plan in real time. I turned my attention to my son. He was visibly shaken, caught between loyalty to his new wife and respect for me. The lines on his face, usually so relaxed and self-assured, were taut with tension. He fidgeted, adjusting his cufflinks and glancing toward his bride, as though trying to gauge whether to intervene or to wait. I could see that the event had forced him to reassess the situation, and perhaps, for the first time, see me not just as a quiet, accommodating father, but as a man who commanded respect silently and decisively. As the evening continued, I began to plan my strategy. Retaliation, I knew, would not be public or impulsive. It would be precise, controlled, and psychologically powerful. I thought about the apartment keys she had demanded. That space, which had been a point of contention, would become a symbol of leverage in my carefully orchestrated plan. I started reviewing all my options in my mind, financial, social, and strategic. Every small action would matter. I began observing the reactions of the guests more closely. Relatives whispered behind their hands, photographers captured subtle expressions, and even the staff seemed aware that something extraordinary had just occurred. Social dynamics were shifting. The balance of power, momentarily skewed in her favor through aggression, was beginning to tilt. My calm demeanor contrasted sharply with her flustered energy, amplifying the subtle authority I carried simply by remaining composed. Later, as the formal dinner concluded and the guests began to disperse into clusters for conversation and photos, I found moments to watch interactions unfold. The daughter-in-law, still flushed from the earlier confrontation, attempted to reclaim her composure by asserting herself over minor details, seating arrangements, menu adjustments, and logistics for the next part of the reception. But each time she moved, I noticed small mistakes, hesitations, averted eyes, the faint tremor of impatience. These tiny cracks in her performance were my window into her psychological state. I began discreetly documenting everything. Notes in my mind, subtle observations of behavior, and mental recordings of conversations. Each detail added to a growing map of opportunity. I observed her relationship with my son, the way she sought approval and reassurance, and the subtle ways she attempted to control the narrative of the wedding. Her aggression had been a facade, masking insecurity and overconfidence. She believed power could be claimed by force and intimidation. But she had misjudged the patient observer in front of her. By the end of the night, I had mentally rehearsed every possible scenario, every reaction, every countermeasure. I knew the precise moment when I could reclaim authority, not through confrontation or anger, but through careful execution of strategy and revelation. The guests, unknowingly, had become witnesses to the first act of a longer story. I left the hall quietly, my composure intact, my mind alive with anticipation. Each step I took back to my car, each breath of the night air, was charged with the awareness of what was to come. That night, as I lay in bed, I reviewed every detail of the evening repeatedly. I thought about her impulsiveness, her arrogance, and the way she had underestimated me in front of hundreds of witnesses. That was her mistake. Patience, observation, and strategy would now define my response. I knew that when the next move was made, it would not just correct the balance of respect, it would astonish everyone involved, and deliver a lesson that no slap or public humiliation could ever convey. The thrill of anticipation coursed through me. The calm, deliberate planning, the silent gathering of knowledge, the patient waiting, it all led to a moment that would shift the balance completely. And I smiled quietly, imagining the eventual outcome. A revelation that would shock my daughter-in-law, restore my dignity, and demonstrate that quiet authority, patience, and intelligence are more powerful than brute aggression. The days following the wedding passed in a blur of calculated observation. I returned home and sat quietly in my study, the faint hum of the city outside my window, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside. Every detail from the wedding had been catalogued in my mind: the slap, the audience, the flustered confidence of my daughter-in-law, my son's hesitation, the subtle reactions of relatives and guests. I had observed the imbalance of power, and now it was time to leverage it. I began my methodical approach immediately. Every conversation, every transaction, every interaction became part of a growing web of information. I watched my son's interactions with his wife, noting small patterns of compliance and influence. He believed he was loyal, and she believed she was in control. Both were wrong. I quietly traced financial movements, social connections, and even digital communications. Every piece of evidence added to the foundation of a plan. One evening, I decided to test the waters. In my mind, I engaged my daughter-in-law in casual conversation, carefully observing her body language. She was confident at first, attempting to maintain dominance, but the subtle cracks were visible. The flicker in her eyes when I asked about the apartment keys, the hesitation in her tone, the slight tremor of her hands as she gestured, all of it confirmed that the seeds of doubt I had planted were taking root. I smiled inwardly, knowing that patience was already turning the tide. I began orchestrating small provocations. I left letters and notes subtly visible in shared spaces, documents that hinted at knowledge she assumed I did not possess. I asked neutral questions to the staff, carefully monitoring what information was filtered back to her. I traced financial records and legal documents quietly, ensuring that when the moment of revelation came, it would be complete, undeniable, and precise. Each day was a study in restraint, strategy, and anticipation. My son, still naive in many ways, began to show unease. I noticed subtle hesitation in his speech and small signs of guilt when discussing my daughter-in-law. The dynamic that had been carefully maintained in their favor was beginning to shift. I saw opportunities everywhere in conversations, in digital interactions, in the faint tension that now hung in the air whenever we were all in the same room. It was like watching a play unfold, each act building toward the final scene that I had envisioned for weeks. At night, I would sit in the study, reviewing recordings I had discreetly made, documents I had quietly obtained, and observations I had committed to memory. I cross-referenced each detail meticulously, looking for inconsistencies, weaknesses, and moments of overconfidence. My daughter-in-law had believed that her public aggression had secured her authority. She had misjudged my calmness, my patience, and my understanding of the human mind. She did not realize that every move she made at the wedding had given me tools for the eventual revelation. I also watched her interactions with others in the family and social circles. Friends, relatives, and colleagues had begun noticing subtle shifts, hesitation in her tone, slight discomfort in her posture, micro-expressions that betrayed uncertainty. The social network she had relied upon for validation was subtly turning against her. I did not interfere openly. I allowed the natural ripple of perception and reputation to begin. By maintaining calm, I let her overconfidence work against her. Each evening, I refined my plan. I decided on the precise moment for action, the setting, the approach, and the presentation. I imagined the scene unfolding in front of the guests, the timing of each revelation, the expressions of shock, disbelief, and realization. The suspense was electric. I knew that the impact would not come from anger, shouting, or confrontation, but from carefully orchestrated truth, revealed with patience, precision, and inevitability. Finally, the opportunity presented itself. My daughter-in-law assumed I was unaware of the growing tension and evidence I had accumulated. She continued her normal routines, flaunting her confidence, oblivious to the meticulous map of control and influence I had constructed in my mind. That overconfidence was the key. It was the mistake that would allow the truth to strike with maximum force, exposing her manipulation to everyone involved. I prepared for the culmination meticulously. Evidence, observations, financial records, and social cues were organized and ready. My son, though anxious, was subtly included in the plan to ensure maximum impact. I had rehearsed every scenario in my mind, anticipated her possible reactions, and constructed a sequence that would leave no room for denial or deflection. The anticipation built like a crescendo. I watched her every movement, noting each gesture, tone, and hesitation. The tension was palpable, almost suffocating, as the moment I had envisioned for weeks drew near. The thrill of preparation, the control of information, and the precision of timing made every heartbeat electric. I was calm, composed, and ready. That night, as the family gathered once again in the apartment she coveted, I knew the plan was about to unfold. Each element had been carefully placed, every variable accounted for, every opportunity anticipated. The moment of revelation was not only inevitable, it was about to astonish everyone, exposing her arrogance, entitlement, and manipulation in a manner that would leave an indelible mark on her understanding of power, respect, and consequence. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. And the quiet, patient father, dismissed and underestimated, was about to reclaim authority and dignity in a way no one would forget. The morning of the final confrontation arrived with a quiet intensity. I woke before dawn, the first rays of sunlight just brushing the skyline, and felt the calm surge of anticipation that comes from meticulous planning. Everything I had observed, documented, and patiently waited for was converging to this moment. The apartment she demanded, the arrogance she displayed, the slap at the wedding, all of it would now be addressed with precision and quiet authority. I dressed carefully, choosing a tailored suit that projected confidence without arrogance. Every detail mattered: my posture, my expression, the calm in my eyes. I knew that appearances would set the tone for the confrontation, and I intended to dominate the scene, not with anger, but with measured control. The apartment itself became a stage, a silent witness to the reckoning I had prepared. As my daughter-in-law arrived, I greeted her with a polite nod, my smile calm but unyielding. She tried to maintain her usual confident demeanor, but the subtle cracks in her facade were already visible. She glanced at the apartment keys in my hand, her expression faltering slightly as she realized that her public aggression at the wedding had not intimidated me. And now she was facing the consequences. I guided her into the living room, where documents, receipts, and subtle evidence of her manipulations were quietly laid out. My son followed, nervous but aware of the shift in power. I began calmly explaining what had transpired over the past weeks, the meticulous observations, the recordings, the inconsistencies she had left exposed. Each revelation was delivered without anger, only clarity and quiet authority. Her reactions were immediate and telling. Her face paled, the confident mask she had worn for so long crumbling. Eyes that once held smugness now widened with disbelief. Every carefully rehearsed excuse she might have had evaporated under the weight of undeniable proof. The Russian client's involvement, the attempts to manipulate finances and social perception, everything was laid bare. The room, once charged with tension, now held a heavy silence as the gravity of truth settled in. I paused, letting each piece of evidence speak for itself. The recordings, documents, and observations created a narrative she could not deny. I didn't shout. I didn't berate. I simply presented the facts with unwavering calm. The contrast between her desperation and my composed clarity was striking. Guests, staff, and relatives, many of whom had been present at the wedding, watched silently, absorbing the weight of the revelation. My son's expression shifted as well. He finally understood the depth of my patience and the strategy I had employed. He saw that loyalty alone could not substitute for insight, and that arrogance, when met with quiet intelligence, could crumble entirely. I could see the internal struggle in his eyes, the conflict between his wife's previous dominance and the undeniable authority of the man who had raised him. Hours seemed to pass in what felt like minutes as the confrontation continued. My daughter-in-law attempted to defend herself, but every word, every gesture was undermined by the evidence I had meticulously compiled. I allowed her moments to speak, knowing that each defensive response only reinforced the narrative I had built. Her own actions, once designed to intimidate, now contributed to her downfall. By late afternoon, the resolution was clear. My daughter-in-law, defeated not by anger but by reason and meticulous planning, had no choice but to acknowledge her overreach. My son, humbled by the clarity of the evidence and the calm authority I displayed, began to reassess the dynamics within his household. The apartment keys, the symbol of her earlier entitlement, remained in my possession not as an act of vengeance, but as a reminder that respect and patience carry far greater power than impulsive aggression. Finally, as the day drew to a close, I reflected on the process. The public slap, the whispers of guests, the tension of the wedding, they had all been catalysts, but the true resolution had come from strategic patience, observation, and unwavering composure. I had reclaimed authority, restored balance, and ensured that arrogance was met with clarity rather than confrontation. As I watched my daughter-in-law leave the apartment, humbled and shaken, I felt no triumph in a personal sense. The satisfaction was quiet, almost imperceptible, rooted in the understanding that justice, patience, and insight are more powerful than force or aggression. The story had unfolded as I had envisioned. Each element perfectly aligned, each action deliberate, each consequence meaningful. That evening I sat alone in the apartment, the soft glow of the sunset casting long shadows across the room. I reflected on the lessons of patience, observation, and measured authority. Life would continue, relationships would adjust, and respect would be re-established not through loud confrontation, but through deliberate, thoughtful action.